The argument against, I just put forward as a provocation, as it were, this notion of the everyone is a sovereign, like Huey Long, every man is the king of the household, of his own household. Marlon Brando, Tennessee Williams, Streetcar Named Desire, for instance, cites that. Louisiana, I think, it took place. If the Lockean principle is understood as everyone has a duty to, in Gordon Gekko's phrase, to regard greed with respect to themselves as good, or to put it more into Carneades way, I mean the philosopher from Libya, the 2nd century BC philosopher that Locke presents a version of. If the private utility is not in the sense of Carneades or Hobbes simply to be either the principle of natural law, or in Hobbes' version it's just simply something one has a right to do. If it is to become instead a duty, an actual something one must obey, so that one says making money is virtuous, spending money is a vice, and that greed becomes actually an obligation or duty and part of the moral scheme, then you're more in the sort of Lockean tradition. But this can't be extended in the liberal tradition to the full sovereignty. The sovereign would have to be understood, like the Hobbesian sovereign, to simply be an enforcer of the three ready-made fonts of, or fountainheads of streamlets in the mountains, of principles which are as though decided on in advance, including, in a certain sense, the principle that Agamben is very worried about, that health is one of the things that the government would be worried about. The government in contradistinction to society being the place where everyone would be pursuing their full individual utility, or estates, but not just in the, as for Hobbes, as a right, but actually as a positive duty according to Locke, because there's something like there's something Aristotelian about Locke. The way I think about Locke is Locke wants to reconcile Descartes to Aristotle, and then the way he does it is by saying if Aristotle knew about the situation in the 17th century, what he would do is something like he would recognize something like the Adam Smith understanding, or the Adam Ferguson understanding, and say through this self-interested behavior the human beings evolve these all the things that are make human life interesting, and therefore there's this Aristotelian demand that it's not just a right that one can pursue one's own self-interest, but a duty. And then you'd hear Tim echoes of that, and I think Bill Clinton said something like doing, I can never remember the formulation, but something that amounted to saying doing well for yourself was the way to do good for all. Doing good by doing well. It's some kind of formulation like that, but that's still part of the mainstream, as it were, up until Clinton, at least, up until the Clintons. So that would be liberalism as a kind of duty, greed as a kind of duty, and then you could see why Gene Siskel thought, oh, this speech by Gordon Gekko was the best part of Michael Douglas's performance in the first Wall Street, whereas he thought the rest was over the top. He thought this part of the speech of the character's public presentation was realistic to financiers. So the full sovereignty version, it would be almost as though we would go to the movie Predators or something and apply it, but that's kind of a grotesque, violent version of it. But the full grasping of the law in Kafka's sense is a bit like that, but everybody would be trying. Yeah, I guess that's one point, right? Like, there's a difference between business culture and gangsterism outright, and it's not totally clear, but it's clear that business culture has a different standard than, say, military culture. As a military culture, there you could have an ethos that says never. No, you could have a moral ethos, a strict moral ethos, no lies, no deception in a military culture. That's somehow possible for a military order. Up until World War I, we should remember, wearing swords was still kind of a thing with the military. Then at a certain point that stopped. George Washington fought in wars, but many of the presidents didn't. Military culture versus business culture. Yeah, but certainly in business culture, there's always a question. There's the game theory questions come in, right? As a standard part of business culture, where in a strictly military culture, game theory wouldn't make any sense because you'd have the arte, or you'd have a demand that you have the fortitude to stay with the honorable behavior. That's still possible in a traditional military culture. Yeah, that's interesting. So then you have a hybrid situation where intelligence agencies, which are compelled to become experts at playing dirty ball, as it were, start to be, in a certain sense, rivals and leaders above the military culture. So I would say, in a certain way, yeah, the full sovereign version, that's a Hobbesian type of version. And in a way, Hobbes actually says that, because he says your duty to yourself, to self-preservation, is higher than your duty to obey the laws of the country. you have the right to kill the ones that try to imprison you in the case of a prisoner in jail, just as a POW has the right to break out of or I mean, in the case of a POW, the POW has a duty to break out, but in the case of Hobbes, you have the right to try to break out morally. Of course, the state will attempt to use all means to prevent that and to inflict punishment on, as if the whole Foucauldian themes come in, on the one that doesn't do what the state wants. But from the moral point of view, Hobbes would say you have the right to be a sovereign and to break out, but in the Lockean version, you're a private citizen who has the duty to pursue your own utility as it seems to be useful in this sort of invisible hand type of way of thinking, or evolutionary Adam Ferguson way of thinking. Taken that way, if that is there would be four principles then. There would be four principles. So not just the Lockean life, liberty, and property, or in the American version, like life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I don't know if I really believe it, but I always mention this, that Richard Epstein says the reason for the change was pursuit of happiness was because of the embarrassment, because slavery existed and they didn't want to say property as Locke did. But then I would say with the addition, so life, liberty, property, or pursuit of happiness, plus stated negatively, the right to lie, stated positively, absolute free speech. These principles would then we could then make a one-to-one comparison and sort of say, these are the basic principles of the good of the Constitution, or politeia, in the same way. It's a specific, okay, so then it's a specific interpretation of what Plato set up in the politeia when he said under the agathon, or the good, there must be some principles. And then Socrates put forward the notion that one of the things that Socrates, despite the fact that he claims not to know, that he doesn't know what he knows, like, so for instance in the Meno, when he's sort of immediately says, Meno, you're asking me what arte is, but I don't know. It's ironic, sort of Iron's suppression of his sagacity and pretense that he doesn't know, in order not to offend the polis and then be put to death out of this certain feeling of annoyance one has at being ignorant or inferior in some way. Being ignorant seems to be a form of inferiority in a way that infuriates people. Especially if Socrates, I mean, with the young, they're not going to feel the same way towards Socrates as his contemporaries, who would be more angry at finding out that one of their own is outstrips them in merit in some way. So if you have this situation where the liberal principles are a specific set of principles, it's like saying once we have the notion that justice, or dike, as Socrates says, is improvement of the country or the polis, and then he doesn't say I don't know that, he actually says I prove it through discussion, through dialectic, Platonic dialectic, which is to say just a kind of discussion, and especially ad hominem discussion, where somebody has an opinion and then you argue to that person's opinion, where the opinion means something they truly believe. Um, and then there's the question whether it matters that they truly believe it or whether they're just upholding it for the sake of holding an argument in a logical exchange. One can see then the liberal principles simply stand as one, those four principles simply stand as one set of principles alongside other as a specific answer to the question already put at the beginning of the order, where we're saying politics is the science of the good, or the episteme of the good, and that out of this episteme we should be able to, through the investigation, we should be able to discern what the principles or the arche are by which a good governance should be founded. But it seems that since there's so many changes since the time of the 18th century principles to this, and especially to where the main principles seem to be, as Agamben sees it, like health and safety, rather than life, liberty, property, and the right to lie, or the right to free speech. Yeah, people get annoyed when the health and safety preempt these other rights, but there's a play of those, and then there's several other complexes of ideas in there that, again, we could link up to Soros and Hayek, who are sort of considering the different ways. I guess one way I'll mention to understand it, and which seems to play a role, is if you consider the tradition as starting with the Platonic psychology, that the logos type is supposed to rule over the well, we all have the logos type, thumos type, and bios type within us, but that we're supposed to have the rigorous intellectual type within ourselves rule over the other parts of ourselves, and then that would be good public character and good character, simpliciter. But that if instead we come to say this question of good public character is all Cartesian in the sense of the cognitive substance, but that there's this other thing where we could control the human animal in a different way for health and safety reasons through the art of science, which is to say through building institutions in such a way that they're like the way architects make the flow of foot traffic move through a space. There's something like that where the chariot itself is guided supposedly by the institutional structure through the rational architecture of the institutional structure, rather than through the perfection of the reason, which would then govern over the other parts. So, I mean, I guess ultimately the figure of the everyone as a sovereign would be no different than, I think, what Rousseau already thought when he thought you will merely be forced to be free, because if the sovereign is supposed to have first and foremost the sense of the good of the country rather than their own good at heart, that would mean everyone would have to, as a sovereign, would have to sort of risk breaking the positive law, or the law on the books, in order for the good of the whole, and then the sovereign would appear in the light of the Agathon is theorized in the Youth of Rome and in the Politeia.